The practical basis of the protocol is to get people to realize that it's a three-ring circus that runs life on planet Earth: copper, iron, and oxygen. And if they don't play well together, you're going to have oxidative stress. And there are 20,000 symptoms that are described in the Merck manual. Guess what? They all begin with oxidative stress. I don't think doctors know how energy is made, how bone is made, how blood is made, how babies are made, nor how hormones get activated. All of those 5 components require copper. And copper is Voldemort in medical school, that which cannot be named. And if you don't know copper, you don't know the fundamentals of the human physiology. I truly do not believe that anemia of iron deficiency exists on planet Earth unless you've been in an auto accident and you're bleeding out. No one is aware that the blood test for serum iron is completely irrelevant to anything. We live in this very sequestered world of knowledge that certain subjects are okay to talk about, other subjects are cordoned off, and we're not supposed to talk about that. And I just think it's time to spread the good news of how incredibly intelligent and beautifully designed their body is, but it's based on nutrients that we're not allowed to talk about.
Morley, you argue that most people that are labeled anemic, they actually have an iron overload. Explain your thinking there.
And I'm sure that'll be somewhere on my tombstone. I think there's a lot of confusion about iron. Let's go back to some basic facts. Iron is the number one element on planet Earth. 36% of the Earth's composition is iron. That's noteworthy. And I would venture to say that we're probably the most evolved species on the planet. I mean, after 2020, I would debate that a little bit, but let's just stay with that as a theory that we're the most evolved. So to believe in anemia, what you have to accept is that the most evolved species has lost the natural ability to metabolize the number one element on the planet. It doesn't pass the sniff test. And then as you get into the research, it was actually at the First World War, just after the First World War, they decided to study iron status in society, and they used pregnant women as their subject. So at any given time, 1% of society is pregnant, 99% are not. And there's a very important phenomenon that takes place during the course of the pregnancy. Weeks 1 through 20, the hemoglobin level in a pregnant woman is though she's not pregnant. It's going to be somewhere between 12.5 and 13.5. Starting around week 21, the process of hemodilution takes place, where the body fluid is beginning to build in the mother, but the amount of hemoglobin does not increase. But it causes the hemoglobin numbers to drop, relatively speaking. Now, the person who studied this the most, his name is Philip Steer, and he's a UK-based OBGYN. And in 1995, he did a study with 150,000 live births. I would have been impressed if it had been 1,500. But he did 150,000. And what he wanted to know was, what's the hemoglobin level of the mother who produced the healthiest babies as measured by the APGAR score? It's a very simple, very straightforward study. And what he discovered, I think somewhat to his surprise, and certainly to the surprise of every conventional birthing practitioner, is that the hemoglobin in the mom producing the healthiest babies was between 8.5 and 9.5, or 85 and 95, depending upon what units you're using. And this is absolute heretical level in modern birthing practice, which wants the woman to still be at the 12 level or 120 level. And what's also important to understand is that in breast milk, there's virtually no iron in breast milk. It's actually 0.3 milligrams per liter, which is a very small amount. In infant formula, there's 40 times more iron. And and so there's this complete distortion of reality. The other thing that you don't find in breast milk is vitamin D. There is no vitamin D. And what is breast milk basically? It's retinol, vitamin A. And what's one of the most important proteins in breast milk? Ceruloplasmin, that nobody seems to know about. Certainly don't know how to say it. I was just at the Weston A. Price, and there were about 300 people in the audience. I said, "Okay, now let's learn how to pronounce ceruloplasmin." It was very funny. But the other really important enzyme in breast milk is lactoferrin. Lactoferrin binds up iron. Why? To keep iron from the pathogens that want to infect the baby. Mother Nature has a plan. And colostrum, which is mother's first milk, is very rich in lactoferrin to make sure that there's no iron that's going to be left to feed the pathogens. So then, when around the time of the First World War, they did a study with pregnant women, ignoring the hemodilution, and they decided to inoculate the 99% because the 1% was showing low iron. And there was iron fortification began about that time, but it really ramped up in the Second World War, 1941. The UK, the US, and Canada started adding iron filings, not heme iron filings. And this is profiled in the book by Jim Moon, who's a Canadian-based iron toxicologist. It's called Iron, the Most Toxic Metal. And I've read it 4 times. I think I've got to read it a 5th time because some of my students reminded me of some passages that I had overlooked. But he was brilliant. He's no longer with us. He died about 2016. But the fact of the matter is, that book, if that book were read by practitioners around the world, you and I would not be having this discussion. I can tell you that. But they started fortifying wheat flour. That's where they started in 1941. And now the iron fortification program is completely out of control. And in 1969, the FDA sought to increase the amount of iron in the food 350%, which led to 20-some scientists from around the world converging on Washington, D.C. with one question. What are you trying to do? Kill people? And in a magnanimous gesture, the FDA backed off and just made a 50% increase in the amount of iron being added to the food. We don't know what the original amount was. We just know there's a 50% increase. And now we live in this iron fortified world with being added to the food, being added to supplements, and in many occasions, people are being given iron infusions. And nowhere is there any understanding that in the world of copper iron metabolism, copper's the general and iron's the foot soldier. You don't need to be in the military to know that generals are more important than foot soldiers. But if you want a really graphic example, think of George Patton. He was a really intense general who moved tons of steel during the Second World War. He was pretty good at it. And that's the way copper works inside our body. And so with that as a backdrop, let me answer your question. The part of physiology that I don't think is taught in school anymore is about iron recycling. The formal name is the reticuloendothelial system, RES, that involves the spleen, the liver, and the bone marrow. They're the principal players in that system. And you can't run the recycling system without copper. And the reason why is that as the lifespan of the red blood cell is 120 days, And every day we take offline 1% of those red blood cells. So it's actually about 200 billion red blood cells need to be replaced every 24 hours. And it turns out that it's 2.5 million red blood cells a second. Every second, we've got to be replacing 2.5 million red blood cells. And what that involves is breaking down the red blood cell, getting access to the iron, and marrying that iron up to transferrin, the transport protein for iron, to take it to the bone marrow so we can birth new red blood cells. The Achilles heel of that process is getting the iron out of the recycling macrophage in the spleen. It's a really, really important piece of the process. And that doorway is called ferroportin, iron doorway, ferroportin, iron doorway. And that ferroportin doorway requires a copper doorman called hephaestin or ceruloplasmin, depending upon where that mechanism is taking place. And this ferroportin doorway is essential for recycling the iron. And in the course of a day, we replaced, as I noted, 200 billion red blood cells. Well, that requires 25 milligrams of iron. Okay. 95% of that requirement comes from the recycling system. 24 of the 25 milligrams comes from the recycling system. 1 milligram is supposed to come from our mouth. Who first identified that? It was a British team of scientists, McCants and Widdowson. McCants was a pediatrician. Widdowson was a biochemist. And they teamed up in the 30s. And their work, I think we're in the 18th edition of their nutritional textbook. But they defined the nutritional standards in the UK and then influenced nutritionists worldwide. But they were the ones, I think it was in 37 or 38, that said, oh, we just need 1 milligram of iron a day. And then somehow that got distorted. By 1941, we're dumping non-heme iron, or a very toxic form of non-heme iron into the food system. And so we've got this complete misunderstanding about the recycling system, that we don't need all of this iron fortification that society is being subjected to. No one's talking about the copper side of the pie. When I was out in Salt Lake prior to the Weston A. Price conference, I went to the University of Utah, which was the home of some very progressive research back in the 50s through the 80s. It was headed up by an individual named Max Weintraub. He's the grandfather of hematology. He wrote the very first textbook on hematology when he was at Hopkins in 1942. It's a beast of a textbook. I have a copy of it, and he was a copper guy. And what he specialized in was resistant anemia that doesn't respond to iron, which is the majority of anemia, is resistant. And I think the term they use now is retractable anemia, that it just doesn't respond. But things like B12 anemia or folate anemia or sickle cell anemia, all these anemias have some relationship back to copper. But everyone has been programmed with blinders now that any anemia is a iron issue, which is unfortunate. And what happens in the body is you put iron into a body that doesn't have a need for iron, it goes into storage. There's a very sophisticated system that says, we don't know what to do with this, but we're going to put it in ferritin and lock it away and pray. And no one is aware that the blood test for serum iron is completely irrelevant to anything. the world's authorities on ferritin, like Douglas Kell or Rosio or Harrison, these mega gods in the field of hematology, like, well, the ferritin's not supposed to be in the blood to begin with. Like, why are we measuring that? And the world is now being trained, especially doctors and birthing practitioners are being trained that ferritin is a valid marker. I've actually renamed it. I call it eritin because there's so many mistakes made on measuring it. And we've lost sight of Mother Nature. We've lost sight of the fact that hemoglobin represents about 80% of the iron in the body. That's a big deal. We've lost sight of the iron recycling program. And then two more points of view, and then I'll nail your question very specifically. There was some very important research done by Robert Hodges in 1978, looking at the role of retinol in iron metabolism. It's one of the most impressive studies I've ever seen done, and he was using human subjects, and it was a 3-year-long study. That's a good long time frame to see what's happening. And what they did was they withheld beta carotene and retinol from their diet and watched the hemoglobin decline, as you would expect it would. The reason why is that the mechanism to make transferrin, the iron transport protein, requires retinol for its creation. That's a good thing to know. And so people on a low-fat diet don't realize they're affecting their transferrin protein. But the hemoglobin collapsed, as you would expect it would. Then he did something that no one had ever thought to do. He gave them medicinal iron, and it spiked just as you would expect it would. Any heavy metal, cadmium, lead, you name it, was going to cause a spike in red blood cell production. And it lasted for about 6 weeks, and then it came back down. And then he did what no one had ever done before. He introduced beta carotene and or retinol into their diet, and hemoglobin took off like a rocket, absolutely shot up. And then in a gradual progression, following the growth of hemoglobin, was retinol sufficiency in the blood. And it is a masterful study that nobody knows about. Robert Hodges, 1978. And the part that I think is really tragic is very few people really know what copper does in the body. Maybe by the end of our conversation, they'll have a better feel for it. For those who want to learn more, that's a good source for it. That's how big my book is. It's huge, right? But the thing is that we're not allowed, the FDA prohibits practitioners or the public from knowing the activity or the intelligence of their copper enzymes. So let's use an analogy. When we do a ceruloplasmin blood test, we're measuring the level of ceruloplasmin, essentially its height in the body, but we're not measuring its IQ, its intelligence. There's a difference between height and IQ. So like, I'm 6 feet. How tall are you, Jesse?
5'11".
Okay, well, I'm a little bit taller than you, so that means I must be smarter than you, right? No, right? It doesn't
Not
mean
necessarily.
No, not at all. Absolutely not. But the research on copper and ceruloplasmin fixates on the level of ceruloplasmin, and we're not allowed to know the IQ. And I think that's the blind spot in modern medicine, is not knowing the intelligence of the copper enzymes that I would argue run the body. And so to answer your question very specifically, I truly do not believe that anemia of iron deficiency exists on planet Earth unless you've been in an auto accident and you're bleeding out. The term that's used in the literature is anemia of chronic inflammation. That's a very popular term. Chronic disease, anemia. I prefer to call it anemia of iron sequestration. And what I learned more recently is that under stress, do you know anyone who's under stress, Jesse?
Couple people.
Just a couple. There's two models of stress that have been used since the 80s to study the impact on iron metabolism. One is called chronic social defeat stress, and the other is called repeated restraint stress. Well, those two models were brought to light when? 2020. The world changed during that time frame. And what the scientists have identified now is that under those stress models, there's a rise of a key enzyme called furin in the liver, which causes an increase in hepcidin. There's a rise in interleukin 6, very important immune marker, that causes a rise in hepcidin. And hepcidin is a badass. I mean, it's a very powerful hormone. And so you have a positive regulator for iron and a negative regulator for iron. So, I don't often do this, but let's use a sports analogy. Hopefully your followers will understand football. Hopefully they will. Well, a positive regulator in a football game is the quarterback. Who usually gets the MVP? It's usually the quarterback, because they're making the plays. They're calling the shots, they're making the plays. And that is ceruloplasmin in iron recycling. It is so essential to the process of moving iron. Who's the negative regulator on a football team? Middle linebacker. Dick Butkus from the Bears, 54. The most feared football player in the history of the NFL was Dick Butkus. And he probably ate iron nails for lunch, but the guy was intense. But he stopped the play. And that's what hepcidin does. Hepcidin shuts down the ferroportin doorway that is so important for this recycling system. The iron gets sequestered, walled off. Again, the primal response is if this iron isn't being moved properly, the pathogens are going to get to it, and we're going to have a lot of problems on our hand. So hepcidin makes sure that the iron stays stuck in the recycling tissue. And this is the reaction of most practitioners. They're blind to it. They have no idea what we're talking about right now. They have no idea that there's this dynamic between ceruloplasmin and hepcidin. They have no idea that there's a 95% requirement for the daily supply of iron to make the 200 billion red blood cells. And the world has lost its understanding of the elegance and the sophistication of that recycling program. So I think there's a lot of myth understanding about iron. There's very low levels of understanding about copper, because the meme, my personal opinion is, the meme that runs medicine are two phrases. You're anemic and you're copper toxic. And they want you to believe that. And so I've had hundreds of clients who self-medicated themselves with iron, and they're terrified of copper because they think it's going to cause some, altered disease state in their body. And so I think there's been a lot of disinformation passed around for decades around this, but it all goes back to the First World War. There's aspects before that, but I think that's really was a flashpoint, another flashpoint, Second World War. And then in 1972, Jacobs et al. Were a team of Welch hematologists who put the spotlight on ferritin, and the world's never been the same. When they said ferritin's really important, it's like, oh my gosh, and people lost sight of how the body works. So I apologize for the long-winded response, but I wanted you and your listeners to have a real deep understanding of what are some of the mileposts for why we within the root cause protocol think and act the way we do.
That was a great overview. I'm glad you went there. When we get to the essence of what's going on here, how much of it do you feel is actual corruption versus negligence? You've explained the history here, but what you're saying is the polar opposite of what conventional medicine is still currently saying.
Oh, absolutely.
What is going on that this information is still being suppressed?
Well, here's an example. So, I get up every day, go to Starbucks, get my cup of Joe, and I read and research. And this is today's article. And it's from 2012, so it's really old, right? Gosh, what could possibly be right about that? But it's looking at the dynamic of iron in aging. And there are all these experts now about aging and longevity, and how many of them talk about iron? Very few. It's the most primal aspect of aging is iron accumulation in our tissue. And why does the iron accumulate? And what they say is ferroportin is not working right. They put it in black and white in this article. So I think when I started out, I was probably more conspiratorial than I am now. But there was some active, campaign or whatever. I've just sort of dropped that sword, let it go, and I think there is a lot of negligence. I think there's what really troubles me is the lack of curiosity. That's the part that really troubles me the most. Is that I think far too many people in public, but their practitioners, don't have the curiosity to say, is there more to the story? Could there possibly be other factors than just this moronic belief in lack of iron on a planet that has a lot of iron? And I mean, I can cite some pretty compelling research that would argue, wow, maybe there is an agenda. But I can also cite a lot of other research that says the body of research, Jesse, focusing on iron that never mentions the word copper. That's 98% of the research. And then you have a small sliver of research that really understands that copper's running the show. And I can count on one hand the number of practitioners, the number of scientists that really admire and recognize this interdependence of these two metals that allow life on the planet to exist. And the part that a lot of people might not know, and again, we don't know how long a year was or is. I mean, we think we do, but supposedly the Earth's been around for a few billion years. I don't know. Is that true? I really don't know. But let's pretend that's true. And the astrobiologists have identified that something happened about 3.4 billion years ago. Wow, that seems like a long time ago. And it's called the Great Oxygen Event. And so plastocyanin bacteria in the seabed, in the primordial seabed, started playing with the sunlight. And in that process, they were engaged in photosynthesis. Well, photosynthesis gives off oxygen. What I think is important for people to know is that in photosynthesis, you have two key enzymes, photosystem 1, Roman 1, photosystem Roman 2, but there's a enzyme in the middle. It's called plastocyanin. Plastocyanin is copper dependent, and it moves the electrons from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1 so that we can give off oxygen. The other, I think it's a very interesting enzyme. It's actually the most prevalent enzyme on planet Earth. Anything that's green has an enzyme called rubisco, like Nabisco. Well, rubisco is involved in the separation of glucose from carbon dioxide. That enzyme requires copper. Well, that's a good thing to know. And so Rubisco dominates. It is the number one enzyme on the planet. People love to talk about photosynthesis, but they'll never talk about copper. And so the significance is that when copper began to fill the seabed, and then it began to go into the atmosphere. And when there was 1/10 of 1% oxygen in the atmosphere, it wiped out 99% of life on the planet because it was all anaerobic, right? What saved life on planet Earth? There were actually three chemicals that they've identified. One is what I think is, I would argue, maybe the most important enzyme on the planet. It's called cytochrome C oxidase, and it's a multi-copper oxidase. And the gift of those enzymes is that they turn oxygen into 2 molecules of water so that you can release energy in biological systems. That's a really big deal. To turn oxygen, again, oxygen is the second most reactive element on the planet after fluorine gas. We have fluorine gas, O2, O3 is the third most reactive. We can talk about that at a later point if you want. But turning oxygen into water is a copper-dependent process. Then another chemical that was really important in terms of saving life on the planet, it's called melatonin. You've heard of it. Well, it's not a sleep aid. It's the master antioxidant in the mitochondria. It doesn't work without copper. The master antioxidant in the cell, glutathione, doesn't work without copper. The master antioxidant in the body is called ceruloplasmin. Doesn't work without copper. So this antioxidant infrastructure is totally dependent on copper. And then the third chemical that I think is worth talking about, you've heard of it. It's called cholesterol. So cholesterol appears all the way back to the Great Oxygen Event, and it takes 11 molecules of oxygen to make 1 molecule of cholesterol. So what's cholesterol? It's an oxygen sink. And when you can't activate oxygen to turn it into water, well, let's store it in cholesterol. And so any organism that's under stress is going to have a rise in cholesterol. It's axiomatic. When we have stress in our world, we have oxidative stress in our body. And it's triggered by hormones and just our ability to make energy. But rising cholesterol it's not a disease state. It's just an indication that we're not making energy very efficiently. And that completely flips the narrative. And now we live in a world where statins are the number one product on the planet. And so people don't have that long view that the astrobiologists have. And so a lot of confusion around that. And the key is getting people to remove this focus on enemies, pathogens and toxins and heavy metals, which is very dominant in healing societies, and move it to an energy focus. And that's the work of Douglas Wallace at Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania. He admonishes his colleagues and his clinical peers that they don't understand how energy is made in the biological system. And I don't think they do. And so when we make energy, we can stay in homeostasis. And that's the power of those chemicals. And so I think the confusion is based on a lack of understanding about how these key mechanisms are taking place. And I remember when I got a call back in 2017. I had just started my RCP Institute. Back then it was called the Copernican Institute. And Ben Edwards from Lubbock, Texas called up. He said, I'm really excited about what I'm hearing about your program, and I'd like you to come to Lubbock and teach it to me and my 9 nurse practitioners. And I said, well, I'm not sure I want to do that. He said, what? I said, well, no offense, Ben, but I think you're part of the problem. He should have hung up the phone right then, but he didn't, thank God. And he said, no, wait. You don't understand. He said, you can blame my handlers. He said, but I didn't learn this in medical school. And that was the breakthrough for me to realize, oh my gosh, maybe there is this complete lack of awareness because it's been either overlooked, let's be generous, overlooked, or it's been engineered. Yeah, I don't know where we are on that spectrum. What I do know is that the public and the practitioners need this information to be more effective and impactful in what they do. And I've, as I said, I've dropped the sword of trying to figure out who to blame. I'm focused on educating people, and let's not worry about how it happened. Let's just make sure that we move beyond, get into an enlightened state of let's focus on energy, and then the immune system knows what to do, the metabolic pathways know what to do, and it's a completely different biological system with energy being produced.
Well, let's come back to the cholesterol piece.
Okay.
You got into it, but I want a bit more detail there.
Sure.
It sounded like increased stress creates more oxygen. The cholesterol is a sink for that.
Right.
And then we make more cholesterol as a result. Do I have that right?
Yeah. So you do. 1973, Leslie Clavet, it's actually a guy. He's got his MD at University of Wisconsin, and he became a cardiologist. And then he went to a little school in Boston called Harvard to get his doctorate in science, and he focused on copper research. So he has this unique combination of cardiology and copper. 1973, he decides to test this concept of could lack of copper be causing a rise of cholesterol? Again, you must have copper to activate oxygen, to make water, to release energy. That's the critical chemical reaction. And lo and behold, what he was able to prove in 1973 is that lack of copper causes a rise in cholesterol. Now, for that finding to become science, one other lab needed to confirm his findings. Since then, over 30 labs have confirmed that Dr. Clavet was right, that lack of copper causes a rise in cholesterol. And it's obviously not well regarded within Big Pharma, but that is the actual mechanism. And even the other misunderstanding is that as we get older, we actually need more cholesterol. And that was one of the real important findings from the Framingham study back in the 70s and 80s, and maybe even 90s. In fact, I think it was Scarpelli. I think Dr. Scarpelli, who was the third director, he was on record for saying that the most important finding was that as the subjects got older, the more cholesterol they had, the healthier they were, which is in complete conflict with the cholesterol causes heart disease, which was started obviously by Ansel Keys and his clever thinking. And so that was in 1955, I guess, was when that was at its peak, right after Eisenhower had his first heart attack. And it took until 2016 for Raznikov and Diamond to say, stop it. Cholesterol is not the cause of heart disease. And so we were held in hostage for 60 years, which is unfortunate. But the importance of cholesterol is legendary, not just for the membrane structure and function, but for just the chemical process of making complicated chemicals are very reliant on that. And so it's a gross misunderstanding of cholesterol's role in our biological system.
To go a bit deeper into this piece of too much oxygen,
Yeah.
is that because without copper, the mitochondria can't use that to make energy, and then the body has to deal with that by mopping it up with the cholesterol?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable way of looking at it. That I think one of the greatest mysteries of physiology is that they don't know how oxygen gets into the mitochondria, which is like, seriously? And so the closest they've come is Wittenberg, 2007, husband and wife team, and they threw up their hands and they couldn't figure it out. So no one really knows how the oxygen is actually getting inside the mitochondria, which is fascinating. My son has a PhD from Stanford in biochemistry. He's no chimp. And I asked him, I said, so how does oxygen get into the mitochondria? He said, oh, it's passive diffusion, Dad. I went, bullshit. He said, yeah, you're right. I just wanted to see what you knew. It's like, okay, thank you. Pass that test. But again, we're talking about the second most reactive element. They don't know how it gets inside the mitochondria, which is absolutely fascinating. But once it's inside the mitochondria, it needs to be chaperoned. And it needs to be made into water, which is happening in complex 4, cytochrome C oxidase, so that the energy precursor molecules, ADP, can go over to complex 5, ATP synthase. That rotor is spinning 30,000 revolutions per minute. That's 500 revolutions per second. Try to do a pirouette in 1 second, right? But it's going 500 revolutions per second. And every time it completes the cycle, it makes 3 ATP. Where does that actually happen? Where is the ADP becoming ATP? It's at the beta subcomplex. It's copper dependent. And so that's why I'm kind of gaga about copper in the mitochondria. And people don't know of the work of Auburn University. But anyway, 50,000 atoms of copper, 50,000 atoms of copper in the mitochondrial matrix. And that was borne out in 2004 and 2006. In 2005, there's a research team out of St. Petersburg, Russia, headed up by Ludmila Lutsenko. And she identified that the copper ligand that's keeping track of the copper in the matrix is ceruloplasmin. Oh, wow, that's pretty significant. So most doctors don't know what ceruloplasmin is. Oh, yeah, it's something to do with Wilson's disease. That's how far they'll go. But they don't know that ceruloplasmin is actually monitoring the status of copper inside the mitochondria. Like, that's, to me, that's one of the most mind-numbing facts that nobody knows about. And so the whole infrastructure of the mitochondria, and there's a modest 40 quadrillion in our body. That's 15 zeros. People have this image going back to high school biology. They look at the picture of the cell, and it had 2 or 3 mitochondria. What they don't realize is that picture was drawn by Walt Disney, has nothing to do with reality, and the average cell has 500 mitochondria. The average mast cell, 1,000 mitochondria. The average liver cell, 2,000 mitochondria. Kidney cell, 4,000 mitochondria. Heart cell, 10,000 mitochondria. Mature egg in a woman's body is supposed to have 600,000 mitochondria. And it can go down to 100,000. Oh, maybe that's the basis of PMS, possibly, and all of the related conditions. And then there are neurons. There are brain centers in our body, particularly like the substantia nigra. 2 million mitochondria per neuron. Well, there's 980,000 neurons in the substantia nigra. And do you know what the formal clinical definition of Parkinson's is? When 66% of those neurons are dead. That's a lot of mitochondria that fell off the wagon. And so when you begin to put it in this energy paradigm, you have a very different perspective of what's causing imbalance and what's it going to take to create balance and homeostasis. And so I think it's important to ground our understanding in these details so we have a rich appreciation for the sophistication of Mother Nature and the design that went into our body. So that's just me being kind of a nudge about it. But I think it's important to get that level of understanding into the thinking of practitioners, especially because it's not, they've been trained to think if this then that. But if you ask them, why is my vitamin D low, or why is my cholesterol high? I don't know that they could give you a really good answer. And what's fascinating, Jesse, is how did the nation, think about this, how did the nation that has the highest cholesterol end up with the lowest vitamin D on the planet? Now that's a conundrum. And it's a metabolic conundrum, and it has nothing to do with sunlight. It has nothing to do with sunlight. And so people don't stop and say, wait a minute, but don't you make vitamin D from cholesterol? Yes, you do. That's good to know. But no one stopped to say, well, then how do we go from having the highest cholesterol to the lowest vitamin D?
Well, you got to tell us why.
It has to do with minerals. When you withhold copper from an animal's diet, iron fills up in the liver. That was first documented in March of 1928 at the University of Wisconsin, in May of 1928 at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Hart at Madison, Dr. McHarg at University of Kentucky. When the iron starts to fill up in the liver is really designed to store copper and retinol. That was its original intent. That was the original design. Now they've turned it into an iron depot. But as the iron builds up in the liver, it causes oxidative stress. It's axiomatic. Who's the first to go under oxidative stress? It's magnesium. I studied that for like 7 years, this relationship between oxidative stress and magnesium loss, and coined the phrase magnesium burn rate as a result of that, as an indication of the level of oxidative stress in your body. And so copper's down, iron's up, iron's creating oxidative stress, magnesium loss. The enzyme to make storage vitamin D requires magnesium. Ding, ding, ding. And that's a good thing to know. And then the enzyme to make active vitamin D requires magnesium. Ding, ding, ding. And so if you've got a lot of oxidative stress, you're going to have dysfunctional vitamin D metabolism. And what is critical to make copper bioavailable? Oh, you have to have vitamin A in your diet. And what blocks vitamin A uptake? Taking synthetic vitamin D at the yin yang because you're afraid of your numbers. And so that's the distortion that we're living with, is these workaround supplementation programs because people have lost sight of the physiology that runs the body.
Well, let's stick on this vitamin D piece and talk about supplementation because that's controversial. A lot of people in our world would say that's one of the primary supplements we should be taking, or at least measuring for and then taking if needed. You've just given a reason there why we wouldn't want to do that. But talk more about vitamin D in a general sense. Are we overshooting the numbers by supplementing, pushing it too far? Is there ever a need to supplement? Let's go a bit deeper here.
Sure. I think it's great. It's a great area of dialogue and discussion. I think the world suffers from what I call dementia because they don't understand vitamin D metabolism. One of my students is a dentist in Manhattan, and one of his good friends is a functional doctor. a very high profile, I'm not going to mention his name, but he's a very high profile functional doctor in Manhattan. And my student said, would you be willing to talk to this guy? I said, sure, I'll be honored. And so the day came, he calls. He said, Morley, I'm really impressed with your research. I think you make some really compelling arguments. He said, but I think you're completely wrong about vitamin D. I said, great. Now we have something to talk about. And I asked him one simple question. I said, so how do you measure the active D in your patients? He said, the what? I said, well, there's a 25 hydroxy form of D, which is storage, and there's a 125 dihydroxy vitamin D. Oh, I said, and they need to be in a relationship with each other. They do? And I said, well, yeah, according to Kenny Merlier, who's a famous endocrinologist in the Netherlands, there should be the numbers for active D should be twice those of storage D. Oh, I didn't know that. And then we talked a little bit more, and then the conversation came to a close, and he said, well, would you do me a favor? I said, sure, what can I do? He said, could you capture what we talked about so I can teach my colleagues? I said, sure, I'd be honored to do that. So I think there is a gross misunderstanding about vitamin D and what it does. I think it's Key Diet at Vanderbilt University has done some really compelling research on vitamin D and how magnesium dependent it is. He's done some wonderful studies on that. So I think that would be a good thing for people to know, that there's a relationship there. And the part that I think people are not aware of, a couple parts, but one is that many, if not most, of the studies that talk about vitamin D faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, and all these attributes are based on correlation, not on causation. Correlational studies they're intriguing, but they're not compelling. And what's very interesting is to go back in time. Again, one of the most important things I was taught. I spent a day with Michael Greenberg, who's a famous consultant for the natural food industry. And people are always asking him, Michael, what's new? What's new? And he said, Morley, I've learned to ask what's enduring. And it was that conference, that day of work together, that got me to discover the great oxygen plant. But what I also have done is really tried to study what was the early research focusing on. Back in the 1910s and 1920s, they were doing some amazing research on what? Retinol. What were they doing with the vitamin D fraction? Throwing it in the trash. So that's a good thing to know. And they actually reference that there's no value to this vitamin D. And now we're supposed to believe, 100 years later, that it's the sine qua non of our body. It's why we're here. Like, well, let's go back to that oxygen event. Vitamin A came on the planet 700 million years before vitamin D. That's a good thing to know. Again, I don't know how they know this, but I'll accept that they know what they're talking about. I'm putting my faith in the education and the integrity of these astrobiologists. And what is vitamin A? It is a light sensor. Light, the photons. We're going to do something with that. And that's what vitamin A does. It's incredibly sensitive to light. What's vitamin D? It's a light filter. It blocks light. And yet it's been billed as the sunshine vitamin. Wink, wink, get it? And so it's all the universe of the truth. And so vitamin A is, in fact, the critical light sensor, and vitamin D is a light filter. And so when you look at, and it was actually Weston A. Price who figured this out, that the sunlight during the winter has more blue light, and sunlight during the summer has more red light. The frequency of red light relates to copper. The frequency of blue light relates to iron. That's intriguing. And so we are designed as a species to make hay while the sun shines. Let's make a lot of vitamin D during the summer months. And guess what? Our liver stores it, and it's good for 6 months. And this idea that because it's winter months and the vitamin D level is lower and we're going to get more sick, no. The I originate from Baltimore, and my nickname is Baltimorley. My older son coined that when he was hanging out with his lacrosse buddies at Cornell. They thought that was a funny name, but it stuck. And I worship at the altar of Hopkins. There's some pretty smart people there. I mean, they're not pristine, but they know what they're doing. And Muhammad Amer in 2014 did a very important all-cause mortality study. Again, 2014, I know, oh, you don't understand COVID, and it's like, we'll get there. So 2014, all-cause mortality, there was no clinical value above 21 for storage D. This idea that you should crank it out to 100 and then you don't have to worry about getting sick is absolute poppycock. And the other part of it is, as it relates to the immune system, vitamin D suppresses the immune system. Vitamin A downregulates. There's a difference between suppression and downregulation. Suppression is if someone is trying to sleep, you suppress it by putting a pillow over their head. Downregulation is you sing a lullaby. There's a very different level of interaction between a pillow and a lullaby. And so vitamin D is the pillow, and lullaby is vitamin A. And I think people have been trained, like circus bears, to believe that D is where it's at. That's all we need. And in a world that has no regard nor respect for copper, it makes sense. Copper is only bioavailable because of retinol. Why? Because the vitamin A becomes what are called retinoids. And so retinol becomes retinoids. Well, there's a whole spectrum of retinoids. And some of the most important are the retinoic acids. All-trans retinoic acid, 13-cis retinoic acid is particularly important. There's a 9-cis. But there's 4 retinoic acids made in vitamin A metabolism. 4 hormones. Vitamin D only has 1 hormone. And so the reason why the 13-cis retinoic acid is so important is that it activates the enzymes ATP7A and ATP7B. 7A is called the Menkes protein. 7B is called the Wilson's protein. But vitamin A, that 13-cis retinoic acid, activates those enzymes to load copper into the copper enzymes. They can't work without copper. You're supposed to have 8 copper atoms in ceruloplasmin. The really avant-garde would say, well, it can work with as few as 5. What kind of car do you drive, Jesse?
I have a van.
How many cylinders is it?
I think 4. I'm not a big car guy, but
And maybe at some point in your life, you drove a car that was a V8. And if 3 cylinders went out, it would drive very differently than if it was a V8. And that's what they've done. They've changed the V8 of ceruloplasmin to a V5. And it's lost some of its punch. But there are hundreds of enzymes that are copper dependent. They'll tell you it's only 9, but then you'll start to dig and dig and dig and find out, wow, there's a lot of enzymes that no one likes to talk about. And they don't work unless ATP7A is fired up and doing its job. And there's all sorts of environmental and food chemicals that block that mechanism. What a surprise. What a coincidence. And so we live in this world of make-believe that doesn't know about copper, thinks that retinol is toxic. So we have copper toxicity and vitamin A toxicity. Wink, wink, don't you know? And we're supposed to be drowning ourselves in vitamin D Well, I did a webinar a number of years ago, actually during 2020, 90-minute webinar, where I introduced people to 13 studies that documented that vitamin D is not your friend. It increases the storage of iron in the tissue. It lowers ATP production. In fact, there's a smoke alarm in our cellular structure called hypoxia-inducible factor. It's a very important mechanism. It affects over 2,000 genes. When hypoxia-inducible factor fires off, the whole infrastructure of the cell changes. And this was in 87, a team of scientists in Israel discovered that, vitamin D seems to put black tape over the smoke alarm. So we've lost this natural primal, this hypoxia-inducible factor goes back to the beginning of time. And we're losing this sensation of, I got a problem. I've got hypoxia. And most of the hypoxia in our body is functional hypoxia. And if you want to do a fun Google/AI search, just put in the search engine, what are the 5 mechanisms of copper deficiency that affect functional hypoxia? And it'll just churn out very compelling breakdowns in the cellular signaling, cellular energy production, iron accumulation, things like that. And nobody knows this. Why? Because copper and retinol have been pushed off the landscape. We're not supposed to know about that. And when did this really come to a head? At least from my perspective, I'm here in Chapel Hill, home of gain of function research, going back to the 1980s. And what were people told to do during that momentous period? They were told to take high dose ascorbic acid, high dose vitamin D, high dose zinc, right? That's the perfect triad to kill copper in the human body. And so I renamed COVID in April of 2020. COV stands for copper's vanished. ID stands for iron's dysregulated. Again, back to the research of 1928. Suppressed copper, iron rises in the liver. And what was the big bad event during that period? Cytokine storms. What fuels cytokine storms? Ferritin coming out of the tissue into the bloodstream. And so the average practitioner wouldn't know that because most of those practitioners have an MD degree. And what does the MD stand for? Mineral denialist. And they've not been trained to understand the elegance and importance of minerals to not just run the body, run the immune and the metabolic pathways that run the body. And so they're missing this cornerstone of physiology. And they're not taught physiology the way I think they should be taught. They're taught pharmacology. If this, then that. If this, they're great at memorizing stuff. But ask them why is my vitamin D low? Why is my cholesterol high? Why do I have plaque in my arteries? Why are my bones getting thin, doctor? And I can tell you for a fact that the last thing you want to do is take calcium and vitamin D if you have osteoporosis. It is the worst possible solution because it does nothing to rebuild the energy production in the bone matrix, does nothing to reestablish lysyl oxidase, does nothing to reestablish ascorbate oxidase. These are really important enzymes to build back the bone matrix. And no one is talking about that. And so we live in this very sequestered world of knowledge that certain subjects are okay to talk about, other subjects are cordoned off, and we're not supposed to talk about that. And I just think it's time to spread the good news, if you will, of how incredibly intelligent and beautifully designed our body is, but it's based on nutrients that we're not allowed to talk about. So it's just
Well, we're going to talk about them here. Continue to.
I appreciate
So
that.
far on our no-no list, vitamin D supplementation, calcium, zinc, ascorbic acid, We're going to come back to a couple of those,
Right?
but I want to stick with vitamin D and zoom back from what you've shared already.
Sure.
In a practical sense, given all that, obviously we're not going to supplement, but what is a healthy vitamin D level and exposure to sunlight? You mentioned the 6 months that we can store it. What does vitamin D in a healthy sense, practical sense, look like?
Measured in the storage fraction, it would be 21 nanograms per milliliter. That's a very healthy. Now, the powers that be would want us to believe that it's 30 to 100. 30 is considered low and deficient. 100 is considered optimal. But again, back to the research of Muhammad M and others, 20 is more than enough. If you're at all worried about your vitamin D, go outside. Just go outside. And you don't need to be stark naked. You don't need to be on the equator. You need to have exposure to your eyes. That's where it's actually triggered. The production of vitamin D is triggered in the retina, not, I mean, there is a conversion of cholesterol under our skin that becomes vitamin D. I'm well aware of that, but it only takes a few minutes of sunshine to the eye to rebuild what's needed. And so there's so much hysteria about how much time we need to be in the sun. And again, at the very least, if I were king for a day, I would ask that we marry up these nutrients that relate to each other. Calcium and magnesium, they have a fascinating relationship together. Sodium and potassium, fascinating relationship together. Copper and iron, not copper and zinc. That's the foolish thinking of Carl Pfeiffer back in the 60s. But copper and iron, the great scientists, Warburg, LVM, Schultz, these mega names that people have never heard of. They might have heard of Warburg, but Krebs. I mean, they were all studying copper and iron. Why? Because they were fascinated by making energy. Zinc has nothing to do with making energy. But then vitamin A and vitamin D, they need to be married up. What is the relationship between these two nutrients? And I would bar people from talking about one without talking about the other. That's where we've gotten into a lot of problems scientifically and clinically, is cordoning off and say, well, let's just talk about iron. No, let's just talk about vitamin D. And the body doesn't work that way. And we can't have a completely integrated model that would overwhelm our cranium. But the point is, these nutrients are incredibly interdependent. And we've lost that elegance in our dialogue. And I think that's where the real mistake is made. The active portion of D should be about 45. When it rises above 45, what the body is doing is it's creating antimicrobial peptides. And there's wonderful research about that outside of the kidney, macrophages have this ability to make active vitamin D. Really cool. That's you're talking about intelligent design. And so why would the body, that's a backup plan. It's a very powerful backup plan. But the acute microbial peptides, antimicrobial peptides, are seeking to suppress the pathogens that are rising in this body. And that's the safety valve, if you will, to protect our immune system. And so when I first came on the scene on Facebook, and I started pushing back on vitamin D, you can imagine the blowback. It was pretty intense. And then we instituted a policy it took about a year to institute it, but it's still to this day is part of the framework. You cannot talk about storage D without talking about active D. And people, I was so insistent at the beginning, you had to post your active and storage D before you could talk about vitamin D, just to drive into the cranium the fact that there are multiple factors. And some of the research that I was most grateful for was Jim Stevenson Jr. I don't know whether you've ever talked with him, but he's actually an industrial engineer whose wife almost died from a vitamin D overdose. And so he set it upon himself to become an expert in vitamin D metabolism. Really smart guy. And we have this belief that all storage D is going to become active D, right? That's what you would assume. It's 20 different metabolites that can be made from storage D. And it depends on what's going on inside the body. And so there's a lot more diversity to our metabolism than we give credit for. And it really depends on what the body thinks it needs in relation to the level of energy production, the level of oxidative stress, the level of hormonal imbalance, and what have you. And it's important for us to move beyond this very pedestrian first grade concept of all storage D is going to become active D. It doesn't work that way. And so I think that the world has been programmed to fixate on one nutrient at the exclusion of its partner, which is vitamin A. And I think that Ancel Keys played a critical role in that when Eisenhower had his heart attack in September of 55, he seized on that. Let's get rid of the cholesterol. And when you get rid of cholesterol in the diet, you're going to get rid of retinol because you're getting rid of fat. And the reason why that could be problematic is you can't absorb copper unless you have fat in your diet. And you can't metabolize fat unless you have copper in your body. And so, again, this is not my opinion. You talk to Dr. Lutsenko at Hopkins and talk to Chris Chang at Berkeley. And they'll tell you emphatically, you can't metabolize fat without copper. And so these are these megastars in the world of copper research that nobody knows about. But they're pumping out compelling research to blunt the belief system that's being run by conventional medicine.
Let's come back to ascorbic acid.
Sure.
You're not a fan. Let's differentiate that from actual vitamin C.
Okay.
And talk about the myths there in conventional thinking.
It's an amazing subject. I have the greatest respect for Albert Szent-Györgyi, MD, PhD. Back in 1925, there was this huge argument between Warburg and I'm blanking on the other scientist. And Warburg said that it was activated oxygen that ran cytochrome C oxidase. Not Wittenberg. I'm embarrassed. I can't think of his name. But in any event, he said, no, it's activated hydrogen. And Albert Szent-Györgyi saved the day by saying, actually, you're both right. And he was able to explain this Tikaya Upatheka, this two rivers flowing into one. This is actually what's happening inside complex 4 because of the hydrogen pump and the oxygen showing up. It's absolutely amazing to study it. But he was the one that brought the whole mechanism together. He should have gotten a Nobel Prize for that. That paper that he wrote in 1925 was amazing. Of course, nobody knows about it because that's 1925. It can't be valid now, right? And so he turns his attention away from the mitochondria he was really studying redox metabolism, reduction, oxidation metabolism that's taking place in the body. And he was an impeccable scientist. And he, in 1937, December of 1937, he gets the Nobel Prize for his work, but the focal point of the work was about, quote, discovering ascorbic acid. So a lot of people might know that. December 1937, Szent-Györgyi. And Szent-Györgyi is Hungarian for St. George. And what what did St. George do in mythology? He killed the dragon. What's the dragon in our body? It's called inflammation. What causes inflammation? Excess iron. Why is the iron Billy? Because of a lack of copper. Ding, ding, ding. And so in July 4th, 1936, 18 months before he gets the Nobel Prize, he writes a letter to the editor of Nature Journal. There's no bigger journal. That's the top of the pecking order. Nature's at the top. And I have a copy of the letter, and it very clearly states, again, this is Sven Gorky writing to the editor, ascorbic acid does not cure scurvy. He was studying hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid is copper dependent. What's so important about hyaluronic acid? It's the whole wound repair mechanism in the body. And what he was focusing on was substance P, substance permeability, the permeability factor. What I don't know, Jesse, is how did this impeccable scientist who had this genius moment in 25, studying hyaluronic acid, studying Hungarian red peppers that have whole food vitamin C complex in them, allow the Nobel Committee to hang the discovery of ascorbic acid on his work. It makes no sense, because he was a man of integrity, and to this day I don't understand it. Ascorbic acid was actually invented in Hoffmann-La-Roche laboratories in 1934. That's when ascorbic acid first came on the scene. So there's this overlap between Hoffmann-La-Roche and Albert Sven Gorky. And somehow they got transposed, or one blocked the other. And the design of the whole food vitamin C complex has like 6 parts. So 6 or 7 parts. So we have, when we're driving our car, we have an engine, we have a steering wheel, we have 4 wheels and a cover. That's pretty much the design of the car. And that's the design of the whole food vitamin C complex. And the engine of the vitamin C complex is an enzyme called tyrosinase. Very, very important enzyme. And if you think it's just focusing on melanin production for hair color, eye color, skin color, I've got a bridge I'd love to sell you. Tyrosinase is one of the most important enzymes on the planet, because it has homology to what? Ceruloplasmin. Wow, that's pretty important. And what's one of the most overused chemicals in food processing? Tyrosinase inhibitors. Why would they want to do that? Color is really important on the planet. Color is really important. And the color of our organs is really important. There's a reason why the heart is red, why the liver is brown, why the gallbladder is green, and why the spleen is supposed to be the color of an eggplant, a very vibrant purple. And when I was describing this to some students a couple of years ago, one of the students was a general surgeon. And she said, Morley, I've never seen a purple spleen in all my years of surgery. So why is that important? Because if an organ doesn't have its right color, it doesn't have its right frequency. If it doesn't have its right frequency, it can't function properly. And so color is really, really important. Tyrosinase is insanely important, not just for the outside, but for the inside as well. And so the engine is tyrosinase. Got these other parts, the permeability factor, factors J, K factors. And this was probably the individual who did the most writing on this was Royal Lee, who founded Standard Process. He was very aware of the complexity of the vitamin C molecule. And what's the cover of the car? It's called ascorbic acid. And ascorbic acid is an antioxidant. Some would argue it's a pro-oxidant, but I think it's pretty well accepted as an antioxidant. But it's the cover, not the complex. And the reason why this is important to know is that the first journal article that really described the depth and complexity of ceruloplasmin was written in 1948. And the authors pointed out that ascorbic acid denatured ceruloplasmin so the copper came out like diarrhea. Causes the copper to become unbound from its complex. And that's not a good thing. It's meant to be. So you've been in a car on the highway, you're going like 70 miles an hour. Would you ever open the door and just jump out?
Of course not.
No, you wouldn't do that. No one in their right mind would do that. But that's what happens in the presence of ascorbic acid. The ceruloplasmin just kind of opens up its kimono, and suddenly the coppers come out. And that's what got captured by Carl Pfeiffer in the 60s. He was a PhD before he became an MD, became a psychiatrist. That should make you a little nervous. And then he was a principal in the MK Ultra Mind program at the CIA. That should make you even more nervous. And then he wrote an article talking about the importance of ascorbic acid and, the copper-zinc ratio, don't you know? He's the guy that introduced that pearl of insanity into the world of science. And then he wrote a book called Mental and Elemental Nutrients, like he was some demigod of knowledge. But he was helping run the MK Ultra Mind program. So when I find out that invalidates everything else he did. That's how my mind works. I just like, okay, the guy's, he's, and the thing is, he ran, he was located in Princeton, but he was, in my humble opinion, a very misguided individual. And so the ascorbic acid is used today, principally where it's used in great quantities, is in cancer therapy, right? High dose ascorbic acid, and people seem to get better. So let's pick at that a little bit. The whole basis of cancer therapy is we've got to kill the cancer cell. And cancer metabolism is it's fascinating to study. And there's a famous book written by Sam Apple on Otto Warburg. And the title of it is called Rabbits. If you haven't read it, it's an amazing book. I mean, where Sam Apple got all this knowledge, I don't know, but it's a fascinating page turner. And what he wants you to believe is that the cancer cell is ravenous for sugar. It's actually ravenous for iron. And Warburg knew that. Warburg had three passions. He was fascinated by oxidative phosphorylation. He got the Nobel Prize for discovering complex 4. That was his claim to fame. He was fascinated by photosynthesis, and he was fascinated by cancer metabolism. And they're all related. And he knew that. And in 1966, he was addressing the 1966 scientists, the body of scientists that won the Nobel Prize. And he schooled them up on what he knew about his research, particularly as it related to cancer. He said, cancer is very easy to solve. They didn't tell him what the answer was. So a very, very interesting speech that he gave at that meeting. And we live, again, in this world of delusion. And this idea that we're supposed to kill the cancer cell. Well, in some respects, Cancer cells are like adolescents on drugs. And last time I checked, I don't think we take those adolescents and shoot them. We try to rehabilitate them. And so the whole cornerstone of oncology is based on killing the cell. It makes no sense at all. But that's the accepted model. You talk to anyone who's had cancer, they want it out of their body, kill it, whatever you've got to do. And I've had family members and friends who face that conflict. But again, it's all programming. And recently I was having fun with a dear friend and neighbor who is really gifted at AI research. I said, well, let's game the system. Let's find out. And the long story short is that when you lack copper, you're going to create cancer metabolism. And maybe in a subsequent conversation, we can get into the bowels of that. But what happens is once the cancer metabolism takes hold, it affects copper proteins inside the cell, and they start releasing copper. And so what have oncologists been trained to do? Chelate copper out of the cancer cell to prevent angiogenesis. And they think they're victors. And it's a complete distortion of what the cancer cell is really trying to do is get back to aerobic metabolism. Because what is the Warburg effect? It is anaerobic metabolism in the presence of oxygen. Why would an organism choose to use the most inefficient means of making energy in the presence of oxygen? Because it has no copper. That's why. There's no other explanation other than that. And it's like people, it's not complicated. And then it gets really interesting when you, back in 1926, so this was actually 5 years before Warburg got the Nobel Prize in 31. He got the Nobel in 1931 for the enzyme. Its EC classification number is 1.9.3.1. So he gets the award for the complex in the year that, whatever, my mind is fascinated by things like that. But in 26, he's competing with Johannes Fibinger, who's a famous biochemist back in the day, as to what was the cause of cancer. And Warburg was arguing that it was metabolic. And Fibinger said, no, it's a parasite. And there was no award given in 1926. The Nobel Committee argued for 1 full year. And then they finally, in 27, awarded the 1926 Nobel to Johannes Fibinger. Warburg went ballistic. But what was playing in the background was a guy named Montrose T. Burroughs. I just love that name. That is such a handle. He was a 1909 graduate of Hopkins Medical School, working at the Rockefeller Institute. That should make your sphincters tighten. And in 1925, he writes an article that, in fact, it's retinol deficiency that causes cancer. Wow. In 1926, he publishes 4 papers reaffirming that position. It's lack of retinol that's causing cancer. Well, apparently Fibinger must have caught wind of that. He gets the Nobel Prize in 1927, end of 27, and in the beginning of 28, he writes an article recounting his theory about parasites and says it's retinol deficiency. And 4 months later, he's dead. And one of the more compelling talks at the Weston A. Prize was by Lee Merritt, talking about parasites causing cancer, which I think is a pretty well accepted phenomenon. And as she was talking, I thought, gee, I wonder if there's a relationship between parasites and retinol. And lo and behold, parasites cause retinol deficiency. That's a good thing to know. That's a really good thing to know. And what is really interesting is to weave in the research of Ulrich Hammerling from Germany, 2016, talking about a mechanism called the signalosome. Have you ever heard of it?
No.
Okay, that's fine. It's a complex that hangs between complex 3 and complex 4 in the mitochondria. And the bottom half of the complex is retinol. And it turns out one of the most critical mechanisms of moving the electrons from complex 3 to complex 4 is that they need to ride the carbon tail of retinol to get from 3 to 4. And if you don't have retinol in your diet, that's what causes the Warburg effect. And he puts it in black and white, and it's the most amazing article to read. And so there's the accepted explanation, and then there's a scientific explanation that actually makes sense. We're supposed to blunt our intellect and adopt to what they want us to know. But I keep digging until I find someone like Hammerling who says, this is what's really going on. It's like, that makes so much sense. And it all ties in with all this other activity between Fibinger and Warburg and Burroughs. And it's like, there's an amazing sea of activity taking place. And you have to take the time to dig and sort it out and then try to find where are the interconnections between all of this. And that's what I've tried to do, is step back and say, what's the bigger picture? How does all this fit together? And it's led to this protocol that says, stop doing this stuff. It doesn't seem to be in our best interest. Why don't you focus on this stuff? Because it's really going to help you make ceruloplasmin and make more energy. And a lot of people seem to be benefiting from it. And that's really my simplistic mind trying to sort through this wheat and chaff of insanity in the research to get to what was Mother Nature really seeking us to do? What was the original intent in our design?
Well, during our chat today, we've done a great job of going into the detail, covering a lot. But I think a good way for us to wrap up is to get really simplistic and get to the protocol. So given there's a lot of detail out there now for people to understand behind the scenes what's happening, what does this look like in a practical sense?
Great question. What I would invite people to do, one of the most important variables in this process, Jesse, is, does the individual believe in the body's natural ability to heal itself? One of my students, she was a graduate of Mayo Medical School. Her dad went to Harvard. She thought, what can I do to out-trump the old man? She went to Mayo, and he said, I'm impressed. But she's OBGYN over in Temple, Texas. Just a wonderful clinician. And she asks all of her patients now, if I gave you all the nutrients that your body needs to heal itself, do you believe in its ability to do that? And she says, 99% of the people believe it. Absolutely, I know I can do it. 1% she has to really work on. So that's very encouraging. But people need to do a gut check. Do I believe in my body's ability? And they also have to be willing to stray from convention. What's the famous saying by Mark Twain? If you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to switch sides. And I think that's where most people find themselves in society now, is, huddled with the masses, because there's protection in the masses, right? So you got to get out away from that and strike a path. The path less traveled is very, very important. That's certainly the path of the RCP. But what I think people need to do is understand that there are phases to our protocol. That what we're really trying to do is restore adrenal health. We're trying to restore mineral balance in the body. We're trying to restore fat metabolism in the body. We're trying to make sure that the base minerals are present. And again, we've grown up in this world that is very agnostic to minerals. They didn't tell us what the mechanisms of action were. They didn't tell us that you can't make vitamin D, storage D, without magnesium. They didn't tell us that osteoporosis is in fact caused by an iron buildup in the bone because it's not recycling right, and it's causing calcium loss. They forgot to tell us that the that the acid phosphatase enzyme to create osteoporosis is triggered by iron, that the alkaline phosphatase enzyme to rebuild the matrix is triggered by magnesium. Or what happens to magnesium in the presence of iron? It's out the door. And so we don't know these base interactions. And what we're trying to do in the protocol is ground the understanding about how important bioavailable copper is, especially this master antioxidant protein, ceruloplasmin, that has it's 1,046 amino acids. It's one of the biggest proteins in the human body. It's a tank, has 8 soldiers inside, supposed to have 8. Um, there's differing theories why it's losing its coppers, but we won't go there for now. But the thing is, it is about the whole premise of big pharma is one gene, one protein, one function. Ceruloplasmin is one gene. It is one protein. One gene, one protein. It has 9 enzyme functions. There's 15 known substrates that ceruloplasmin can change. It's well documented in the literature, but it's not taught in practitioner school. And so it's a real threat to the one gene, one protein, one function model. And the very origin of the RCP was my reading a very important article by Ray Peat on the dangers of iron. And towards the end of the article, he said, to my knowledge, no one has ever come up with a recipe to increase ceruloplasmin. Bong. Said, that's what I'm going to do. That's what the book is all about. And so I made a point to study it. And when the protocol first emerged, there were 2 stops and 2 starts. Well, now there's 14 stops, and I think it's 13 or 14 starts. But the starts are in phases to allow people to ease into this lifestyle. It's not a diet. It is a lifestyle program. And the 2 of the most important components of the protocol, getting down to very practical issues, obviously based on eating healthy food. We recommend the Weston A. Price diet because I think it's one that makes the most sense, and we can talk about that at some point as well. But obviously, minerals are very important. Vitamin complexes, very, very important. Real whole food vitamin complexes, not the foo-foo stuff that they want us to think about. And it's really important for people to get into a regular program of blood donation to lower the iron footprint. It's immensely important. Like I'll be 73 in a couple of weeks, and I've got 26,000 milligrams of iron in my body. We're designed for 5,000. Men are designed for 5,000. Women are designed for 4,000. And this model, it's a very simple model. Take your age, multiply times 365. It's not my formula. It's the formula that's used by all iron biologists on the planet. They know what's happening. The iron biologists know about this study. They're very well versed in this. They know that aging is iron accumulation. We just didn't know that. And so Ray Peat made this comment, let's get a recipe. I developed a recipe. It is controversial. By design, it's controversial because we got to wake people up. We got to get them out of the stupor that the system is there for us. It's not. We've got to take responsibility for ourselves. And so donating blood is very, very important in the program. The other key component is dumping your fear. And what people don't realize is that when we're in a state of fear, and we spell it differently, it's Fe-AR, that way you see the symbol for iron. When you're in a state of fear, you become a magnet for iron. And that's the research that we just came upon in the last few months. This fear and all of these factors, the stress models are driving iron accumulation that we didn't know was taking place. And where is the iron accumulating? In the mitochondria. What's killing energy production in the mitochondria? The iron buildup, because it can't get out. Why? Because the doorways in the mitochondria and the cell are shut off. Why are they shut off? Because they're copper dependent. And so the practical basis of the protocol is to get people to realize that it's a three-ring circus that runs life on planet Earth. It's copper, iron, and oxygen. And if they don't play well together, you're going to have oxidative stress. And there are 20,000 symptoms that are described in the Merck manual. Guess what? They all begin with oxidative stress. That's the triggering mechanism for all of those conditions. And I didn't know that at first. I worked in hospitals for 32 years. I really thought, wow, they know what they're doing. No, they don't. Because I don't think doctors as a body know how energy is made. I don't think they know how bone is made, how blood is made, how babies are made, nor how the hormones get activated. Why do I say that? That's a very offensive thing to say. Well, the reason why I take that stance, Jesse, is that all of those 5 components require copper. And copper is Voldemort in medical school, that which cannot be named. They're not taught about copper metabolism. And so if you don't know copper, you don't know the fundamentals of the human physiology. And I think to me, that's what's got to change. We've got to get back to the origin of how we evolved, how we emerged with energy production, that there's a reason why we transcended from anaerobic metabolism to aerobic metabolism. So when you're burning sugars or burning fat with oxygen, there's this explosion of ATP. That's really important to know. And that's why humans have evolved into this higher order level of thinking. That's our gift. And we wouldn't be having this switched on conversation on these really fancy computers without higher order thinking. I would argue that all of that's been made possible so that we can metabolize oxygen with copper to activate the production of energy or the release of energy. And it's great that iron is carrying the oxygen. It's a waiter. That's what hemoglobin is. It's a waiter. Releases oxygen. But copper is the chef. It's turning that oxygen into water. And I think that's the missing piece of the puzzle for the public. And it doesn't need to be complicated to understand how energy is made. And once you start to make energy, brain fog goes away, the fatigue goes away. A lot of different factors begin to recede into the background as the body is able to restore its natural rhythm of energy production and the recycling. And the number of recycling systems in the body is amazing. And guess what they all require? Gotta have copper. Autophagy doesn't work without copper. The whole concept of the bone matrix, the recycling that takes place there, highly dependent on minerals. But copper is what's really directing the energy production and the key components of the recycling. And that is it's lost in the modern era from my perspective.
So it's become very obvious. Copper is at the heart of this. We want to make sure we're getting enough copper, and we're currently not. You mentioned the Weston A. Price diet. Last question for you. If somebody's following that diet or something similar, how much of these nutrients can we get from diet alone versus supplementing?
I think we're faced with a world now that's changed because of glyphosate and COVID. We need to move beyond the innocence of Dr. Price's era. I mean, I have just the greatest respect for his research and what he did to try to document his findings. But glyphosate is a beast. It's a very powerful chemical. Nothing stops glyphosate. Had a very life-changing conversation with Stephanie Seneff over that back in 2018. She said nothing stops glyphosate down to a pH of 1. And then you pick up the research of Don Huber at Purdue University. And he's got this logarithmic scale of how minerals are being chelated by glyphosate. Well, a logarithmic scale is like a earthquake. Earthquake of 3 is no big deal, dishes rattle, but no one gets hurt. Earthquake of 12, there's no life after that. It's all gone. And so glyphosate chelates calcium and magnesium at a 3, chelates iron and zinc at a 9. That's faster, but it chelates copper at a 12. Well, what does that mean? It means that glyphosate is chelating copper 1 billion times faster than calcium and magnesium, and 1,000 times faster than iron and zinc. The problem, Jesse, is those big numbers make no sense to us. It goes right over our head. 1,000 times faster? I mean, I know what twice as fast is, or 3 times as fast. 1,000 times faster? 1 billion times faster? And so we tend to disregard that. And the idea that glyphosate is only commercial farms? No. It's in the air now. It's worldwide. And the famous study done in France in 2022 to discover that 99% of French citizens are now peeing glyphosate in their urine. So I think the food system was very different today than it was 30 years ago. That coupled with changes in food processing. High fructose corn syrup is a very powerful chemical. I don't know whether people know that, but it chelates copper by design. Wow, didn't know that. And then we've got some very powerful medications that do the same thing. And so I think we are duty bound to follow the wisdom of Dr. Price and go to farmers markets and get the best possible form of that food that we can. But I also think we are at a point in life on the planet where we need to supplement. We absolutely need to make sure that we're getting the minerals, that we're getting the vitamin complexes, that we're getting the nutrient factors that are critical for these metabolic pathways that I don't think are in the organic food that we're all trying to locate and sequester for our diet. I think it's a very different world now. And I think it's going to be that way for a good long while until the regenerative farming movement has a more dominant footprint in society. And it's growing by leaps and bounds, but the infrastructure of the CAFO farms is so enormous. I think we really need to be prudent to make sure we're getting the critical nutrient cofactors, which we talk about in the RCP, and make sure that is complementing and supplementing a very healthy diet.
So we know iron toxicity is a big piece of this, or iron dysfunction, the way you label it in your book. Somebody might be thinking now, if I adopt the Weston A. Price diet, I'm eating a lot of red meat. That has a lot of iron. Talk about the difference there between iron found in food, in red meat or other meats specifically, because I know there's heme and non-heme iron, and we won't go down that whole non-heme iron train today, versus supplementing. And then we'll end it there.
So yeah, there's a massive difference between heme and non-heme iron. 95% of the research in iron is on non-heme iron. That's very interesting. 5% is on the heme side. Body knows what to do with heme iron. It goes back way back in time. But we're not supposed to eat animals, right? That's very dangerous. It's got fat. Lean meat. Don't eat fatty meat, right? I mean, the programming is just so predictable. And again, whether you're eating red meat or whatever, you got to have copper in your diet. In order to metabolize the iron, in order to recycle the iron, in order to mature the red blood cell, and so on and so forth, you must have copper. And it's had a very low profile for many decades. And I think the public is only mildly waking up to that reality. And we've got to get past this assertion that it's toxic. It's not. There's a complete misunderstanding about that. But the thing is, Um, if one of the great books is Primal Body, Primal Mind by Nora House. And I love the line when she's talking to the anthropologist, and she says, "So what did early man and early woman eat?" And if they're telling you the truth, that the paleontologist would say they ate the fattest meat they could find. That's what our physiology is really designed, not lean meat. So we need the nutrients that are found in fatty meat, and you got to have copper to go along with that. So organ meats are really, really important because they have a lot more mitochondria, and copper's hanging out there. So I think people need to step back from some of the programming that they've been exposed to, and take the time to study what we talk about within the RCP from an ancestral point of view. Historically speaking, our ancestors ate organ meats and threw the muscle meat to the dogs. Now we've flipped that narrative. We're so sophisticated. We eat the muscle meat and we throw the organ meats to the dog. And people don't realize that there's been this wholesale reversal of how animals are supposed to be fed. And there was a reason why our ancestors ate organ meats, because they were nutrient dense and had the cofactors that would run our body. And so we need to go back to the basics. And don't be fearful of iron. Be fearful of how little copper you have in your diet. In the 1930s, the average diet delivered 4 to 6 milligrams of copper. By the 1960s, it had dropped to 2 to 5 milligrams of copper. And now today, in the modern era, quote unquote modern era, we're lucky if we get 9/10 of 1 milligram of copper. And so no one's taking stock of that other than people like Jamie Collins or Leslie Clavet or people of that stature. And they're like, this is a serious problem, folks. And what Jamie Collins has done is taken, he works with rodent models, but he's taken the amount of iron fortification and supplementation that we as humans get, he's programmed it down to the rodent size. And when they're exposed to that level of iron, guess what it does? It silences copper metabolism. And so it's just, we're not aware of the amazing research that's being done on the planet just around these two metals and how interdependent they are. And we again, we're back to, we have monocrop farms and we have mononutrient focus. Just get some more iron. Just get some more calcium. Just get some more vitamin D and it'll be fine. And no one's stepping back to say, wait a minute, aren't these guys working in pairs? Aren't they working in relationship? And that's what I think we're missing, context and perspective in modern nutrition. I think that's really the biggest gap that's holding us back.
All right, Morley, I know you got to go. We're going to end it there for today. Really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate you. I know you've just come out with your second edition of your book. We're going to link that up in the show notes, your website, your social media. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Jesse. Appreciate the time. It's been great.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
I do believe in relying on ketones and free fatty acids as a primary source of fuel. I think we're well designed to do that. We've always selectively hunted the fattest, sassiest animals. What we have between our ears has an enormous metabolic